Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, live on the Microsoft campus, and my guest today is Drew Squires-Cabala. Hey, Drew.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about SDK Style SQL Projects. Sounds very exciting. But before we do, I want you to introduce yourself to our viewers who may not know you.
Hey folks, I'm Drew. I'm a PM in the SQL tooling space. I focus on tools for developers, and a lot of times I get involved in taking developer code and turning it into a live database, so the world of SQL DevOps.
Excellent. So, SDK Style SQL Projects. So, very high level, what does that mean? And then let's refresh our memory on what a SQL project is in the first place.
Yeah, I'll start with what a SQL project is in the first place. The SQL projects are a set of code for your database. You think of a C# project where you have the code before you've compiled and then loaded it to a server, deployed it basically. For SQL projects, we say instead of working against production, you don't need to develop in production, you want to develop against a set of source code that represents your database. All of a sudden, your database is in source control, you're able to track changes, and now different developers can be working on feature branches, like they might be for application code, and then merging that together before it gets deployed.
Cool. So your code is your SQL statements, your stored procedures.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All of it, your table definitions, all of that becomes your project in Visual Studio. And these have been around for a little while.
Yeah.
They're known in Visual Studio as the SQL Server Data Tools, or SSDT component. They work with kind of a breadth of DevOps capabilities, so you can build and then deploy them from pipelines. But because they've been around for a while, they're an original style C# project, essentially, under the covers. Okay. What we're really excited about right now is we have an SDK library for SQL projects now, Microsoft.build.sql. And now we're bringing these SDK style projects into Visual Studio. This brings us a couple different benefits, and as we work on this process, it's going to take some time for the original projects to be replaced by the SDK style SQL projects. And with that, the SDK projects are going to be in preview for a little while, and that's what we're announcing today.
So let's also review the benefits of the SDK style project, because you do file new project and yeah, you have a project file, but file new project and then you start writing code and UIs and whatever.
Yeah.
And I gotta be honest, I don't spend a huge amount of time. I know the project style changed, but I don't spend a huge amount of time necessarily thinking about it. So
yeah,
let's review why SDK style projects are a benefit in the first place.
I'm in Visual Studio here with an original SQL project, and it's loaded in Solution Explorer. There's just that couple files, a table, for example. I'm going to unload it real quick so we can get under the covers at the SQL project itself. And all of a sudden, we start kind of recoiling in horror at the complexity of the project file.
And you also had to unload the project, which now I remember I don't have to do anymore. So already there's a big benefit.
So not only do we have a lot of verbosity going on here, one of the key elements of that verbosity is you have to explicitly include every single SQL file. And as you're working in parallel with other developers, two people add a table, different tables. Those two files are separate, but now you have a merge conflict on your project file. And that's not a great place to have those kinds of complexities.
Okay.
And then the other part of the original SQL projects that is not a problem in Visual Studio, but you find it as you get further down the development process, and that they're dependent on .NET Framework. So if the rest of your build infrastructure is on Linux, your SQL projects you then have to have separate build infrastructure for, and that's not great. If we switch over into our Visual Studio preview, I've already got the SQL proj file open. I haven't had to unload the project.
Yep.
It's a lot shorter.
Yes.
It's
a lot more readable.
This is the equivalent of what we just saw before. And the Microsoft.build.sql is our project SDK.
Okay.
So now we've, just by the virtue of switching to an SDK style project, we've gained some leaps and bounds. That's cool. But we don't want to stop there. We're starting to introduce feature improvements to the SDK for SQL projects in general. So you're getting more out of SQL projects.
Cool.
One of the things that we're able to show immediately is instead of having references to the compiled artifact from a project, when you compile a SQL project, it outputs a DAC pack file. Similar to you compile a C# project, you get a bunch of DLLs. You can reference between those files in the original SQL projects, but that does mean that you have to do a lot of copy pasting and keeping artifacts around on build servers. Not great. What do you do with C# projects when you need different artifacts? Use package references.
Right.
You use NuGet feeds. And we've introduced support for DAC packs in packages on a NuGet feed in SDK Style SQL Projects. All of the system databases that you might need for a statement like getting the active connections in a stored procedure, referencing master there is supported simply by virtue of having that package reference to master. You could package up one of your metadata databases or one of your fact table sets into a NuGet package. And since it's more stable, have your own internal NuGet feed and reference it instead of having to move a bunch of files around.
Yeah. That's cool.
So all of this comes together, and now in preview in Visual Studio, there's those SDK Style SQL projects as part of Solution Explorer. You can create a new project, you can edit existing ones, and we'll have a guide published for how I want to convert my project.
And is the template to do that installed automatically, or is it an individual component or something?
It is an individual component. So when you go into your Visual Studio installer, under the individual components, if you search for SQL, you'll see preview SDK Style SQL projects.
Awesome.
Yeah. While I mentioned earlier the benefits to kind of the build infrastructure changes, this is kind of a universal statement. So where we demo from here is just specific to GitHub only by choice. This applies to Azure DevOps or whatever other build environments you're using. I've popped into a repository that I've checked that SDK Style SQL project into. And then I've got a couple different example pipelines to show off SQL projects as a part of now your developer lifecycle. The first one that I'm going to show off is in GitHub, when you hit New Workflow and you grab the .NET template, it does a few things. It gives you an Ubuntu host. It gives you a .NET setup for the latest LTS release, so 8 right now. And then it runs .NET build. It's pretty simple, pretty lightweight. And this works pretty much out of the box with your new SDK Style SQL projects. It'll set up .NET 8. It was already installed on my runner. And then when I run build, my SQL project built, and I'm getting my DAC pack output artifact.
Cool.
And it was 18 seconds to just run that. So as far as getting CI type build checks set up, that should be real quick once you've adopted SDK Style SQL projects. Now, as you check code in, you're able to make sure my database references are valid. I haven't mangled anything up in the process of developing. When I think of CI, though, I don't want to really stop there. You want to make sure not only is the code valid, but is it good? I don't write beautiful SQL. Many of us don't. This is why ORMs are so popular, or this is why DBAs are always going to have a job. But with the SDK Style SQL projects, there's a project property that you can either write to the project file, or I can include on my build statement for run code analysis true. And what this does is, in addition to compiling the database model into this deployable artifact, it also is going to output a code analysis result. It shows me in my build output here as well that I have a view with select star in it, which is not super great. But it also has put this into an XML. So if my DBA team wanted to have validated results of these are the kinds of anti-patterns that we do or do not have, We can get this. Now add this to your CI. Now you're really cooking here with you're developing a database and making sure that it's staying on track throughout the process.
That analysis, it's going to look at your stored procedures. Does it look at your table structure, your indexes, your relations? Does it tell you that you ought to add an index here or not do a particular thing there? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the old style SQL projects because this is one of the things that we're porting over right now. And when I've got my code analysis setting on my SQL project, there's rules that come out of the box.
Okay.
And they go over a number of different categories. The one that I was violating earlier is using select star in anything. It can check naming. So there's about 15 rules that come included with SQL projects overall. The cool thing about everything we've talked about today is it's built on top of a .NET library that is extensible at a number of different places. So this is the DACFX library. We have portions of it open source on GitHub at Microsoft/DACFX. And one of the extensibility points is code analysis.
So people could write their own code analyzers for databases.
They write their own rules.
That's exciting.
They just write, the extensibility on top of that. There are a couple really cool...
Have people started doing that?
Oh, yeah. There's
Excellent.
a couple of sets of community rules out there that are fantastically extensive. We're talking about 60 and 100 rule type sets. And those are one of the things that as we extend the concept of package references in SDK Style SQL projects, that's another piece that we're bringing in preview, is just being able to reference those as you get package references. Right. I'm going to say something that's going to sound a little weird in the year that we're in, but right now you have to copy those DLLs around with your original Style SQL project.
But you're going to fix that.
But we're fixing that now.
Okay.
So the extensibility around the DACFX library for code analysis means that this is something that if you have a specific naming convention in your organization, you write that code analysis rule, add that to your SQL projects, and now as part of code check-in, you're able to make sure that everyone's following that naming convention.
Nice.
I want to show off one more important part of, I'm going to say, SQL projects and SDK style SQL projects. The first part of SQL projects that I kind of abbreviated before earlier is it's great that you're developing your source code, but you still have to figure out how to deploy it.
Right.
And you could do some kind of handcrafted artisanal migration scripts. You could have an ORM writing those for you and probably doing a pretty good job most of the time. But with SQL projects, there's tooling that takes a look at your build artifact, connects to the database that you tell it, hey, I want to deploy this DAC pack to my test environment, my production environment. And you've got two options there. You can say, tell me what script you think I should run to update that database to match this code. You, as you write and do your development, you don't need to think about necessarily where it's going or what state that database is in. You're focusing on declaratively what I want that database to look like. The script that it outputs would be potentially an alter table statement. I can't always write an alter table statement correctly first time through. It just gets tricky. So we've got tooling that'll give you that, or depending on the environment that you're running to, you could just say, hey, just deploy this. Don't tell me about it, just do it. And in that case, we have an example pipeline here that, again, because we're doing SDK style SQL projects, we can use Linux-based hosts. I can have Docker running in my pipeline.
Okay.
And I'm going to use a paradigm sometimes called a sidecar container, where I say, I want another container available in my pipeline. And in this case, I've just grabbed the latest SQL Server 2022 container. So put this in my pipeline because I want to do some unit testing, maybe with my application code. And I know what the database should look like.
And is this container running locally? Is it running in Azure? Yes.
It's running in my GitHub Actions environment. In this case, I'm using the default containers or the default pipeline images. So those are based in the Azure infrastructure. But I'm not hosting any of that. I'm not worried about particularly like how do I make sure I have the availability. I'm just using the provided runners. But
Cool.
yeah, so this is just the SQL Server container. It's going to be developer edition, so I'm not worried about licensing or anything. I'm just trying to do my job as a developer.
Right.
With that container, as a part of my pipeline, after I've built my SQL project, I'm going to use the SQL action for GitHub. It's called Azure SQL Action, but that doesn't mean that it's limited to Azure. It does mean, however, that I can take something such as a DAC build artifact and give it a connection string to my local host in this case, and say, put that DAC on that database server. Give me a database that matches this DAC. So in this case, it's going to create some tables, create some views.
Nice.
And the net here is that maybe I'm testing that my DAC could be deployed. That's a valid scenario. But as a developer, as I'm building an app, I really want to be able to test my application against something real. Stubbed out unit tests are great. They get us to a certain point. But what if I'm able to test against a real database?
Yeah.
And now you'll be able to set that right up.
That's cool because it means you don't necessarily have to create the mock database somewhere and then switch back and forth between real and mock. This just creates a database, you use it, and then it gets torn down when you're done.
It's gone.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah. So that was kind of an introduction to SDK Style SQL Projects, how they benefit you both for kind of collaborative development and getting these bigger projects where you might have different database references, but also they're a part of your development process. You've got all these options for CI/CD integration with them. So we're excited that they're in preview now.
Yeah,
Visual
cool.
Studio. Yeah.
So, so is it part of the Visual Studio preview? Do you have to get this and install it into the preview?
Yeah, so it's going to be in the Visual Studio preview releases for 17.12 we're on right now.
Okay.
With that, it is a component that you grab from the installer.
Got it. Yep.
And it is also in preview. I will share very candidly that there's a lot of work that goes into replacing those original SQL projects with these SDK ones, and I'm not going to get to the end of 17.12 and say, hey, we're ready. These are GA, so you don't have to switch over immediately right now. We have a guide for converting existing projects, but these SDK style projects are going to be in preview for a little while. So give them a try. Go ahead and install that component. You can even do a side-by-side Visual Studio install if you like to keep things clean. But the SDK style SQL projects are going to be a preview component within Visual Studio and available right from that Visual Studio installer.
And then the best way to comment on them is through developer community?
Yeah.
Same way you do everything else?
Yeah, you just grab your little comment there in your upper right corner. I'd love to hear from folks giving it a try. We're really excited to have people develop with it, give it a try, and then let us know what features you're looking to have beyond where we're going.
So if I'm in Visual Studio writing SQL code, does GitHub Copilot help me yet?
GitHub Copilot can absolutely help you with your SQL code.
Nice.
It doesn't have knowledge of your database. If you're connected in the SQL Server Object Explorer over on the left side, it doesn't have the context from the database, but it does have context from Visual Studio. And so when you're working with the SQL project, it knows an awful lot about all of the objects that you've been creating.
Cool.
So yeah, it's right there for you.
All right.
Well, thanks for having me, Robert.
Yeah,
I'm super excited to bring SDK style projects here.
Thanks for coming on the show and showing us.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, so try these out. Get the preview, try them out. Let these guys know what you think. Hope you enjoyed that, and we will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.